And this is not formulaic language. Stephanie Jamison is professor at the Department of Asian Languages and Culture at UCLA, where she teaches Indo-Iranian literature. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has long served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Oriental Society, one of the most important journals in Oriental Studies. Professor Jamison earned her PhD at Yale University under the supervision of Stanley Insler, and her dissertation became her book on the Aya formations in Vedic, a volume that is on the shelf of every Sanskritist and Indo-Europeanist. And her vast production also engages with literature, religion, and historical socio-linguistics. I will only mention, because it's impossible not to mention it, her translation, together with Joel Brereton, of the entire Rig Veda, literally a work of both great art and great science, and also of great generosity, I would say. And I would like only to highlight one feature that, in my opinion, characterizes her research, and is one of the reasons why I admire her writing so much. That is her extraordinary sensitivity to the text. And this sensitivity has been placed at the service of highly abstract and technical linguistic analysis. Sometimes I am thinking, for instance, of her study about the tense of the predicated past participle in the Vedic and beyond. But it also enabled her to squeeze from the texts all the information that can allow us to glimpse more concrete aspects, such as sociolinguistic variation in the ancient Indo-Iranian languages. And for instance, she studied what we can infer about how women spoke as opposed to men. But I think I have already spoken too much, so I will now give the floor to Professor Jamison, who will talk about unifying strategies in the hymns of the Rig Veda, ring composition. You have the handout in the back. Please, Professor Jamison.
Thank you for this very, very generous introduction, and I'm very grateful to the invitation to come here, and to Laura for extending it. So I'm happy to be here. As I need hardly tell this audience, the Rig Veda, the oldest Sanskrit text and one of the oldest in any Indo-European language, has many singular qualities. One that is often not remarked on is how, almost from the beginning, it has been misrepresented and, dare I say, mistreated, both within its own tradition and in modern scholarly work. This is the first item on your handout. Let us begin with the name, which goes back to antiquity, the Rig Veda or Urg Veda or Urg Samhita, the Veda or collection of verses. The text consists of and was transmitted as a collection of 1,028 hymns or suktas. This is the form in which it is still published and referred to today, but it is never called the Sukta Veda, the Veda of hymns. Instead, its name references the approximately 10,000 individual verses that make up the 1,000+ hymns. This fragmentation results from the ritual use made of the text almost as soon as it was collected. In post-Rigvedic Shrauta or Salam ritual, the hymns were broken down into pieces and single verses or runs of verses were inserted into a fixed liturgy. This disaggregation resonates with the later trend in Indic literature, both in Sanskrit and Middle Indo-Aryan, towards the genre of self-contained single-verse poems, muktika verses. In Sanskrit, the collections by Bhartrhari and Amaru, for example. In Prakrit, the justly famous Satasai attributed to Hala. So the tendency to take the verse as the compositional unit of the Rig Veda was firmly entrenched in the indigenous tradition by the time the modern West became acquainted with the text. When this happened, the text became chiefly the province of historical and Indo-European linguists. And though editions and translations of the text hew to the hymn and mandala format in which it was transmitted, the fragmentation only got worse. I'm afraid that my fellow Indo-Europeanists and linguists have generally treated the Rig Veda as a vast warehouse of intriguing and archaic forms, which they happily pluck from context, barely interesting themselves in the verse in which they're found, or even the pada, certainly not the larger hymn. Thus, I find myself in the odd position of having to assert and defend the structure of the text as transmitted. I can't think of any other comparable example among ancient texts. We do not dissolve Homer or Pindar into thousands of separate lines. It's a weird literary tradition that presupposes such radical disunity. Most literary traditions would at least assume that most poems, especially short ones, transmitted as poems, should be taken as unities unless there's compelling evidence to the contrary. One of the major aims of the recent 2014 Rig Veda translation produced by my colleague Joel Brereton and me was to recenter attention on the hymn as the compositional focus, to seek unity, conceptual development, poetic responsions, and structural skeletons within this more capacious space. And at least from our point of view, we succeeded. The more we assumed that hymns were unified wholes, the clearer became the devices the poets used to produce this unity. One of the most common of these strategies is ring composition. The poetic technique of ring composition, demarcating a unified section in a larger text or the whole text itself through verbal or thematic repetitions or echoes at both ends, is widespread and widely studied in archaic literatures, especially archaic Indo-European, including in a number of illuminating treatments by our hostess and the convener of this conference, Laura Massetti. And it has been intensely discussed, especially with regard to Greek literature, for example, Homer, the tragedians, and Pindar, and to a lesser extent elsewhere. The Avestan Gathas have been fortunate in attracting such attention, but it has been only fitfully treated in the earliest Sanskrit texts, the Rig Veda, although it is, I will assert, extremely common there. The term ring composition seems to have been coined by the Dutch Hellenist van Otterlo in the 1940s, though ring compositional analysis of pieces of literature certainly predate the invention of the term itself. In the broadest definition, ring composition involves some sort of repetition, some of the various sorts we'll discuss later, that begins and ends a piece of literature or a self-contained subunit within a larger piece. To quote Calvert Watkins' definition, see the handout, which both describes the technique and explains its function. A particular form of echo serving a demarcative function is the stylistic device known as ring composition. Ring composition is the beginning and the ending of a discourse or a complex utterance longer than a sentence, with the same or equivalent word, phrase, or just sound sequence. It is a signal of demarcation. A series of sentences is thereby symbolically transformed into a finite set, a closed text or text segment. This device, sometimes with more complex nesting of recurrences, is an extraordinarily widespread compositional technique in the archaic Indo-European world." End quote. Things get interesting when we raise the question, what counts as a match? Some, like Mary Douglas, the British anthropologist who popularized the term ring composition in a series of lectures entitled Thinking in Circles, posthumously published in 2010, seem to work primarily with themes, concepts, and big plot elements, and are less interested in their verbal expression. Whereas I think most of us, at least those working on archaic Indo-European languages and literatures, are more focused on the verbal, though not forgetting their contribution to larger thematic structures. The simplest kind of ring composition involves the exact or nearly exact repetition of a word or phrase. Watkins, pointing out the enormous importance in oral literature for isolating unities within a larger discourse, cites the beginning and end of the short but touching recognition scene in the Odyssey between Odysseus and his dog Argos. The scene begins, the dog lying there, Argos, and ends, the dog Argos lay there. The repeated words are the most crucial elements in the scene: the dog, its name, and its position, and the match shows almost exact repetition, and the only variation being between the present participle kemenos, lying, and the finite verb keto, lay, both belonging to the same root, same verbal stem. Basically, I'd say as a working hypothesis that the larger and looser the structure in which a section is being demarcated, for example, a vast epic, the closer the match needs to be to make the delineation as salient as possible for the audience. Hence, in a big sprawling text like the Odyssey, you need very strong signals to perceive the ring. But in shorter and more tightly structured genres, the odes of Pindar, say, or the hymns of the Rig Veda, or the Old Avestan Gathas, the less likely it is that exact matches are used or valued, and the more types of matches are allowed. The ring can be easily picked out of its context, and often there's no context surrounding it if it begins and ends as unified work. So subtler and more playful signals can be used. Overall, varieties of ring composition in such texts are the equivalent of slant rhyme. But if the ring isn't delineated by exact matches, and as I said, exact matches are pretty rare in the Rig Veda, part of the initial feature that opens the ring has to be maintained when it closes to signal that there is a ring. But part of it is varied to show the poet's ingenuity. In other words, the poets must carefully calibrate identity and difference, with the most pleasing examples involving a balance of both. My catalog of examples is mostly organized around what element varies and how. Let us now turn to the text. I have a fairly vast collection of examples of ring composition in this text, which you will be happy to know I'm not going to give all of them to you, many of which are quite intricate and many based on technical linguistic criteria. Unfortunately, I can only treat representative examples here, some of them fairly simple, for want of time. I will produce a rough classification of types, though too rigid a classification would misrepresent the flexible and playful nature of the phenomenon. I'm afraid that what follows will be overstuffed with examples, which will go by way too fast. That's what the handout is for. That's what you can take home. But it's only thus that I can give you an overview of the immensely variable ways in which Rig Veda poets deploy this powerful device. First, what's the domain? Unlike the example I just gave you from the Odyssey, in the Rig Veda, the domain is usually the whole hymn. The matches are generally found in the first and last verses. Rig Vedic hymns average about 10 verses. This is well within the perceptual horizon of the audience, especially an audience trained and engaged in the active listening required by an oral culture. In these cases, the Rig Veda doesn't demarcate a subsection of a larger text, but provides closure to a complete piece of literature, and no doubt helps signal that the end had arrived. However, demarcative rig composition is also found in the Rig Veda, isolating subsections that have other marks of unity, for example, an embedded mythological narrative or a shared metrical form. Now, the Rig Veda does occasionally indulge in the exact or near exact matches of the type we saw in the Odyssey passage. We're now on the top of page 2. But especially when they are marking the beginning and end of the hymn, these matches tend to seem perfunctory, unlike the Odyssey passage where the crucial scene was set and closed by the matching words. Even when the repetition is a fairly extensive phrase, it's often just an incidental part of the descriptive apparatus. Consider the padas from the first and last verses of a hymn celebrating the deified ritual drink Soma. Hinvan or Tasya Dhiditim, he spurring on the visionary power of truth, and Hinvan or Tasya Dhiditim pra advare, you spurring on the visionary power of truth while the ceremony is proceeding. Although the first 3 words of each are exactly identical, the poet has managed to work some variation in. In context, the first verse actually has a third-person subject, he, while the last has a second-person, you, though both with the same referent, soma. And what was a metrically independent phrase in verse 1 has been set into a different metrical form with an additional 4 syllables at the end. But still, the three-word phrase matches exactly and is therefore somewhat inert. One way to avoid this inert impression is by keeping the lexicon constant, but varying the morphological and syntactic configurations. This is the next part of page 2. A simple example is found in the Agni hymn 166. The first pada of the first verse contains the phrase Suro na samdirk, like the sight of the sun, with the root dersi here represented with final K, which is phonologically regular, and the genitive of the noun suvar, sun. The hymn ends with suvar dershike, on seeing the sun, with the derivative of the same root dersi and the same suvar, though in a different case form. Similar is the use of very different morphological forms belonging to the same root or stem. 210, another hymn to Agni, begins with an adjective johutra, continually to be invoked, built unusually to the so-called intensive stem, who invoke. The last word of the hymn is a finite verb to this intensive stem, jo havimi, I continually evoke. Since both of these are rare, the use of the intensive stem provides a salient ring. A slightly more complicated example involves some recombination. It's found in the beginning and end of the Ashvin hymn 1118. In the first verse, the Ashvin's chariot is commanded to drive here, ayatu. The chariot is described in the first pada as shyena patva, having the flight of a falcon, and somewhat later in the verse as speedier than thought, manaso javian. In the last verse, the same verb, drive here, reappears, but with the Ashvins as subject, yatam. They are urged to come, quote, with the speed of a falcon, shyenasya javasa. The two words falcon and speed that had been independently applied to the chariot in verse 1 now combine into a single noun phrase. Another very common strategy of ring composition is relexicalization, the substitution of a different word that has identical or near identical semantics. We're now at the bottom of page 2. With different lexical material, the focus must be on what constitutes the shared feature that makes the ring perceptible. Similar semantics is not usually sufficient. And the poets are quite ingenious at signaling this underlying identity. Consider, for example, 231 and 11, a hymn dedicated to various gods. The second half of the first verse begins ahar, ahar, every day. The final word of the last verse is dive, dive, likewise meaning every day. Although they belong to two entirely different nominal stems, they are synonyms, and more importantly, the fact that they both appear in amredita compounds anchors their synonymity through their shared word structure. In another example, it is a shared adverbial suffix that signals the ring. Now we're at the top of page 3. Although this example is fairly simple, it embodies a central concept of Rigvedic ritual poetics. The Indra hymn 180 contains a refrain in each of its 16 verses. The refrain is Archan Anusvarajyam. They cheer on his, namely Indra's, sovereign power, with the subject of cheer on left unspecified. It could go back to the ancient and mythological sidekicks of Indra, or refer to the current ritualists who praise his deeds now. The relationship between the current poets and their predecessors is built into the structure of the hymn, in a telling ring between the first and last verses. The first word of the hymn is the adverb ita in the current style, qualifying the statement, the formulator created a formulation in the current style. But the last verse, 16, connects this current fashion with, quote, formulations and hymns in the older style, Brahmani Purvata Ukta, created by a series of ancient named figures, Atarvan, Manu, and Dadyansh, with the adverb Purvata directly contrasting with the similarly formed Ita in verse 1. They both have the adverbial suffix ta. Thus, the hymn implicitly suggests that not only was Indra's great victory impossible without his cheering comrades in the refrain, but that poets today, like those in the past, fulfill the same role. In the absence of these types of shared morphological structure, relexification generally needs to keep part of the verbal expression while varying another part in order for the ring to be perceptible. We're now in the middle of page 3. A simple example is provided by the Agni hymn 159. Verse 1 contains the phrase Vishve Amarta, all the immortals. In you do all the immortals bring themselves to euphoria. While the last verse 7 describes Agni with the possessive compound Vishva Kirshti, belonging to all human communities. Vaishvanara, belonging to all communities by his greatness, worthy of the sacrifice among the Bharadvajas, far radiant. The repetition of Vishva, all, provides the ring, and the contrastive nouns it modifies, immortals and human communities, express Agni's role as mediator between gods and men. The word Vishva, all, is not otherwise found in the hymn except in the derivative Vaishvanara, an epithet of Agni meaning belonging to all superior men. Vaishvanara is the dedicand of the hymn, according to the Anukramani, and a form of this epithet occurs in every verse. It is telling that Nar, superior man, the second member, Nara, of that Virgid Bahuvrihi, is actually used indifferently of both gods and humans in the Rig Veda, and therefore serves as a superordinate term for both, connecting the immortals in verse 1 and the human communities in verse 7. The ring thus reinforces the message implicit in the epithet. I'm not sure exactly where to classify this next example. This is the last one on page 3. It involves relexicalization, but via a blend that creates an anagrammatic pun. It is found in the early verses of the very challenging hymn treating the Battle of the Ten Kings, 7:18, attributed to the poet Vasishta and found in the Vasishta Mandala. This hymn falls into 3 parts. The first, verses 1 through 4, recalls the aid Indra has given us in the past and requests the same now. The last pada of the first verse is Tuvam Vasu Devayate Vanishta. You, Indra, are best at gaining goods for one who serves the gods. The second pada of verse 4 reads, Upa Brahmani Sasarje Vasishta. I, Vasishta, have dispatched sacred formulations to you. On the one hand, the poet depicts himself in verse 4 as the embodiment of Devayant of verse 1, one who serves the gods, by producing sacred formulations. But he also combines the verb phrase Vasu Vanishta of verse 1, best at gaining goods, into his own name, Vasishta, from Vasu Vanishta, and therefore also calls attention to the fact that his very name is a superlative meaning best. A trickier example, if there is such a thing, of relexification is found in the Ashvin hymn 180, attributed to the clever poet Agastya. This is the top of page 4. The hymn begins and ends by describing the journey of the Ashvin's chariot around the cosmic spaces. In 1b, this is expressed by Rato Yadvam Pari Arnangsi Diyat, when your chariot flies around the floods, with the phrasal verb Pari Diyat, flies around. In verse 10, the chariot is depicted as Pari Jam Iyanam, speeding around heaven, with the participial phrase Pari Iyanam. The preverb Pari has been kept constant, but the verb has been relexicalized. But Iyana is a near rhyme to Diya, its counterpart in verse 1, and the D that seems to have been dropped from the beginning of Iyana that was found in Diya has been applied in the intervening nominal object, Jyam, heaven. So the relexification is accompanied by 2 different phonological twists. Moreover, there is a complete relexification associated with this figure. In the Sipada of verse 1, the golden wheel rims the Pavaya, of the chariot are mentioned, while its undamaged felis, arishtanemi, form part of the participial phrase in 10c, felis and wheel rims being essentially the same part of the chariot wheel, in case you didn't know that. With two different Sanskrit names, they too form part of the ring. Even more complicated is an example from the famous Indrahem 212. This is now mid-page 4. With its rigid alternation between riddling definitional relative clauses referring to Indra, such relative clauses we heard about earlier today. He who did, or he who is, blah, 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 blah. And the refrain at the end of every verse that answers the implicit riddle. That, folks, is Indra, Sajanasa Indra. This example involves relexicalization as well as syntactic redistribution and expansion. Towards the end of the hymn, the tight syntactic structure of most of the hymn begins to be shaken up. This first becomes evident in verse 13, 2 verses from the end, which forms a variant ring with pada C of verse 1. The 1C is Yasya Shushmad Rodasi Abhyasetam, from whose explosiveness the world has feared. Among other things, this clause contains the only form of the anomalous pseudo-root bhyas, clearly derived from the well-attested root bhi, to fear. The first half of verse 13 expands and repairs this phrase in 2 padas. Dyava chid asmai purtavi namete, shushmat chid asya parvata bayante. Even heaven and earth bow to him, even the mountains fear from his explosiveness. We now have 2 clauses with 2 different subjects. The dual world halves, rodasi, of the first verse has been relexicalized with its exact equivalent, the dual dvandva, dyava purtavi, heaven and earth, who likewise take a dual verb, but not the one whose subject their counterpart rodasi was. The fear verb instead appears in the next pada with a far more orthodox shape, the first class present bayante, replacing the peculiar abhyasetam and thus repairing it, but both belong to the same root, and the ablative of the thing feared, shushmat, remains constant. The subject of the second verb, the mountains, is a new element, though it should be noted that they show up in verse 2, near to the initial pada in question. The famous hymn 10.124, depicting the transfer of power from one group of gods to another, shows relexification with what I'd call intentional conceptual slippage. We're now at the bottom of page 4. By this latter term, conceptual slippage, I want to call attention to the fact that often in the Rig Veda, the repetition or near repetition of ring composition masks a change in the conceptual usage of the repeated elements. That is, apparent formal identity conflicts with the domain of application of those elements. I realize this definition is almost impenetrable as I just gave it to you. It will be clearer, I hope, with some examples. 10.124 falls into 2 clearly differentiated parts. The first 6 verses are a dialogue among gods. The last 3 are in the third person and are spoken by the poet. In them, he describes the transition from the first instituting of the sacrifice, as seen in verses 1 through 6, with gods sacrificing to gods, to the ritual model that prevails now, the reciprocal partnership of humans and gods. In my interpretation, these last 3 verses form a ring, and it is through the shifting reference of that ring that the movement from the divine to human sacrificers comes about, what I have called, quote, an indirect transfer of sacrificial responsibility. Verse 7 begins kavi kavitva, the poet with his poetic craft. The referent of the word poet is actually the god Indra, as the context makes clear. Verse 9 and the hymn ends kavayo manisha, the poets with their inspired thought. Both phrases have a form of kavi in the nominative and an instrumental of near synonymous words for poetic production. The with phrase has been relexicalized, with manisha replacing kavitva, The kavi forms are also in different numbers, singular in verse 7, plural in 9. Moreover, although the poet word kavi is the same, the poet referred to in the first phrase is a god, the poets in the second are humans, as the context makes clear. The lexical identity conceals the transfer of ritual agency. The closed circle of gods sacrificing to gods is broken, and the human divine dynamic established, but the covert verbal identification of Indra and the human kavis implies that the current model of sacrifice derives from the older one depicted earlier in the hymn, and that the human officiants are occupying formally divine roles. In such subtle ways do Rigvedic poets subvert even perfect ring compositional matches. The next example introduces a new category, resolution, in which the closing of the ring resolves an issue raised in its opening. We're now at the top of page 5. 145, an Agni hymn, contains a fairly elementary example of double morphological variation of the type we discussed earlier on. But this is this is combined with what I will call complementary relexicalization. In describing these phenomena, one is driven to making up terms. By this expression, I mean that the relexicalization involves not synonyms, but complementary or antonymic words. The hymn begins, Tam Perchita Saveda Sa Chikitvan. Ask him. He knows. He is the perceptive one. And it ends, Vi Abravit Vayuna Martiebyo Agnir Vidvan Urtachid Di blah blah blah. He has expounded the ritual patterns to mortals, the knowing Indra, for he is the perceiver of truth. On the one hand, there is a quite straightforward relationship between Veda Chikitvan, he knows, the perceptive one, in verse 1, and Vidvang Urtachit, the knowing one, the perceiver of truth, in the final verse, Veda to Vidvan, Chikitvan to the root noun chit. In fact, we could even say that the morphological category of perfect participle has transferred itself from perceive to know. On the other hand, although the first parts of both half verses have nothing overtly in common verbally, Pada C of verse 5 provides satisfying closure to the peremptory opening of the hymn, ask him. The knowing and perceptive God has now provided the answers, has expounded the ritual patterns to mortals, that is, to us. Although this ask and response is the crucial conceptual bit. Without the lexical ring provided by the resonant roots vid and chit, the structure would not have been so salient. Another example where we find where the final verse provides resolution for the opening, here with direct lexical matching, is found in the Soma hymn 974, 1 and 8. This is the middle of page 5. Among the many metaphorical identifications of Soma in this hymn is the common one with a racehorse, a prize winner, Vajan. In the first verse, it is described as seeking to win the sun, with the desiderate of the root sun, win, suvar, sishasati. He is still striving to win in 7a, but in verse 8 he has accomplished this feat, expressed by the perfect participle sasavan, also to the roots sun. And the racehorse, having won, has stridden to the gleaming white tub anointed with cows at the finish line. The sun, his goal in verse 1, turns out to be its ritual equivalent, a tub of milk gleaming like the sun, with which the soma liquid is to be mixed. The perfect participle sasavan provides closure and success to the striving announced in verse 1 through the desiderative to the same root, and the racehorse remains constant. These lexical matches make the equivalence of the sun, suvar, in verse 1, with the gleaming white tub of milk in verse 8 very clear, and establish the linkage between ritual elements and cosmic ones that is such a characteristic of Vedic ritual ideology. Now to another type where the matching is looser, what I call expansion. It is sometimes the case that a condensed word or phrase at the beginning of a hymn is syntactically expanded at the end. A fine example is in fact provided by immediately preceding 974, where suvar was expanded into a complex noun phrase, which, however, has a different but linked referent. I will start with another simple example, although it has a bit of a twist. 525 is a 9-verse Agni hymn in Demeter meter. It's a fairly bare bones affair. Yes, it's top of page 6. The first verse ends with the brief and incomplete verb phrase, Parshati dvishach, he, Agni, will bring to safety from hatred. The last hemistich of the hymn expands this two-word phrase to Sano Vishva Ati Dvisha Parshan Naveva blah blah blah. He will bring us to safety across all hatreds as if by a boat. The first phrase is almost exactly reproduced in verse 9, Dvisha Parshat, with a crucial difference we'll discuss in a minute, but necessary details have been filled in. Most notably, the object of this rescue mission, namely us, Naha, and how it will be accomplished, Naveva, as if with a boat. The root per literally means cross to the other shore, and the model for its usage is perilous river crossings. The locational phrase has also been given more body, but notice that the single word ending accented dvisha of verse 1 is not identical to root accented dvisha here. The accent difference encodes a difference in case. Dvisha in verse 1 was an ablative singular. Dvisha here is accusative plural, and its identity is anchored by accusative plural vishva, as well as the adposition ati, which takes the accusative. So the expansion here also involves and slightly conceals syntactic slippage from hatred to across hatreds. Another example of expansion is given in middle of page 6. The Ashvin hymn 445 concerns their chariot and its journey to the sacrifice, a trope we've seen before. In verse 1, the chariot is described as earth encircling, parijma. In the last verse, the single word epithet has been expanded into a pada-length descriptive relative clause, yena sadya parirajangsi yata, with which in a single day you drive around the realm. The relative pronoun has its referent rata in the immediately preceding pada. Pari is held steady. The noun rajangsi, realm, substitutes for the second compound member chmun, earth. They are etymologically unrelated, but phonologically and semantically similar. And the verb and adverb you drive in a single day at content. A more complicated example is found embedded in a tight structure in a demarcated portion of the Indra hymn 424, now bottom of page 6. The first 7 verses of this 11-verse hymn are somatically separated from what follows and take an omphalos shape. That is, the central verses 3 to 5 have an internal unity, and they are flanked by 2 sets of concentrically paired verses, with verse 1 corresponding to 7 and 2 to 6. It is this last pair we will focus on. The last pada of verse 2 makes mention of one of Indra's favors to his worshippers in the laconic expression, Sushvaye Varivodhat. He, Indra, establishes wide space for the presser. This brief phrase appears in considerably enhanced form in 6 CD, Kernoti Asmai Varavoya Ita Indraya Somam Ushate Sunoti. He, Indra, makes wide space for the one who presses Soma in just this way for Indra who is eager for it. The only word that survives intact is varivaha, wide space. The verbs have been swapped out. Dhat is replaced by kernoti, which in this context is essentially synonymous. But the real expansion is the almost comically detailed explication of the single word dative beneficiary in 2D, sushvaye, for the presser, which takes over most of the hemistich, with the dative represented by pronominal asmai for him, and then defined with the fussy relative clause. The root su, found in sushvaye in 2, is promoted to a full verb sunoti with explicit object soma, absent from the version in verse 2, and an adverbial specifier of the manner of the pressing, as well as the recipient of the soma and his state of mind, namely eager. Though almost nothing is left of the original phrase, their compositional relationship can hardly be doubted, especially since it is enclosed in a multi-part omphala structure. I will now turn to an even more intricate type, what I call the jigsaw puzzle. This is the top of page 7, in which a structure found at the beginning is only completed at the end. I beg your indulgence for a somewhat extended discussion. The example in question is in Indra hymn 877, which concerns a less commonly told myth about that god, his killing of a boar named Amusha, a myth that we find encapsulated elsewhere in the Rig Veda in 1.161.7, Vidyat Varaham Tiro Adram Asta, he pierced the boar through the stone, Indra the archer. Note in passing the two alliterative phrases beginning and ending that pada, Vidyad Varaham and Adrim Asta, which together recall Indra's famous signature formula, Ahan Ahim, he slew the serpent. In our hymn, the myth proper begins in verse 6 and is concluded in verse 10, with the narrative in between, as is usual in Rig Veda, chronologically shattered. Verse 6 begins near Avidyat Giribya, he pierced forth from the mountains, with neither subject or object expressed, but the verb avidyat of the encapsulated myth that we just saw, and a different word for stone, mountain. Verse 10 ends with a self-contained pada, which cannot be syntactically or thematically connected with the rest of the verse. Varaham Indra Amusha, Indra the boar Amusha. It contains a nominative, Indraha, and an accusative phrase, Varaham Eish Amusham, but no verb. I submit that this nominal fragment supplies both the nominative subject and the accusative object lacking in the opening of the myth in 6a, Indra pierced the boar, to match the encapsulated formula found in 161.7. The name of the boar, Amusha, is found only here in the Rig Veda and serves as the answer to an implicit riddle, a riddle held in uneasy irresolution starting from verse 6 and only resolved here. The fitting together of the puzzle pieces, the verb left hanging in 6a, the nouns with nothing to attach to in 10d, demarcates the myth within the hymn, and therefore, despite displaying no elements of the repetition we associate with ring composition, no lexical, morphological, or syntactic matches, it is for me as certain an example of ring composition, or at least the spirit of ring composition, as exact repetition. Yes. I have been primarily focusing on ring composition as a formal device with matching verbal elements of whatever type at the beginning and end of a whole work or a section thereof to mark it and provide closure. And I want to emphasize and keep emphasizing that, at least for me, a formal ring is quite enough. It doesn't need to do anything besides providing a salient echo. However, we've also seen examples where the ring seems to be doing other work, providing resolution or making subtle linkages between disparate phenomena by matching them in a verbal ring. I want to close with a group of examples where I think the poets are using ring composition to express the controlling conceptual ideology that drives the Vedic ritual system. We're now in page 7. To put it simply, reciprocity is the engine of Vedic ritual, especially reciprocity between humans and gods. At their sacrifices, humans offer the gods oblations and extravagant praise in the form of hymns. They expect material and non-material goods in return: cows, horses, sons, gold, long life, victory in battle. It is a business proposition, an explicit contrast, and human poets are not reluctant to spell out the terms. One of the ways they do so is to use variant repetition to express the reciprocity inherent in the human-divine sacrificial compact. These opposing but complementary roles sometimes get expressed as the two ends of a structural ring. 640 contains a rudimentary example of reciprocal ring composition. The final pada of verse 1 ends Vayodha. You establish or create vitality, matched by the end of the penultimate verse, Vayodhat. Both padas begin Atta and contain a dative of the beneficiary. In the first, Indra is the subject creating vitality for the sacrificer and the singer. In the second, it is the sacrifice that is the creator, and Indra, the referent of the second person, Te, who benefits. So, Ata yajnaya gurnate vayodha. Then do you, Indra, create vitality for the sacrifice for the singer, and Ata te yajñas tanuve vayodat. Then the sacrifice will create vitality for you, for your body. A somewhat more complex example is my last one. 336 is an 11-verse Indra hymn. The last real verse of the hymn, verses of the hymn 9 and 10, respond to 1 and 2, though with flipped values. In the first pada of verse 1, a priest, by my interpretation, is ordered to set out this offering, imam prabhurtam. If you do that, I can't read. Sorry, I'm blind and I can only read with light on my... Sorry. It's the problems of old age. So the priest holds out this offering, Imam Prabhurtim, for Indra. In the following verse, to see, Indra is urged to grasp the soma drinks being held forth, prayamyamanam. Here it is the human ritualist who brings forth prabhur and holds forth prayam, the oblations for the god. Verse 9 begins with the imperative abhara, bring here, but in this case addressed to Indra. The lexeme prayam then follows twice in the repeated imperative prayandi, hold forth, which ends verse 9 and appears in the first pada of verse 10, both times addressed to Indra and both times with us as the explicit recipient. The lexemes prabhur, or abhur, and prayam delineate the complementary responsibilities of the human ritualist and the god, with the former serving as their agent in verses 1 and 2, providing sacrificial offerings, and Indra serving as their agent in verses 9 and 10, providing wealth in turn. I'm going to stop abruptly here, though the examples could keep flowing in full spate. What I aimed to do in the talk was to give you a sense of the flexibility, ingenuity, and sheer exuberance that Rigvedic ring composition displays, with examples grouped in loose categories, not in a rigid typology. I regret that I had no time to discuss the nested omphala structure that I have treated extensively elsewhere, but the singleton examples were already too numerous. As a final word, I'd like to point out that not a single one of these examples could have been identified by an electronic database search. They all actually required reading the text, and I would urge you, although I don't think this is the audience that needs this kind of urging, not to allow the scholarly questions you ask to be restricted by whether an electronic search will answer them. If nothing else, it's way more fun to read the text. Thank you.
Thank you.